In the words of Dr. Stephen Strange, we're in the end game now. We're going to give you a sneak peek into our top 20 running back rankings for the rest of the fantasy football season. We're inching closer and closer and closer to the playoffs. You need to know which running backs will put you over the top into championship contention. We'll start in the S tier, work our way down. We've got 5 different tiers for you all, but Ty, in the S tier all by themselves, we have Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. And I think these are the top 2 consensus. These are the top 2 dogs. Maybe you could make a case for 1 or 2 other guys to be in this tier. But for the most part, these 2 belong by themselves in this tier, if you ask me. Who do you prefer between these 2 rest of season? Saquon Barkley or Derrick Henry?
I would prefer Saquon personally. I don't have to mess with a bye week for Derrick Henry, right? Derrick Henry's bye week is coming up in week 14. It's a little inconvenient, but again, for Saquon, this Philly offense, it goes through Saquon. Everything depends on Saquon, right? And so, yeah, you do get some tough matchups the rest of the year, right? You get Baltimore and you have Pittsburgh. But then when you got Carolina and you have Washington, you have Dallas. And then if you play into week 18, which I'm not judging, but I am judging you. If you do play into week 18 of your fantasy leagues, you get the Giants, right? So it is a better rest of season schedule, in my opinion, for Saquon over totally. Derrick Henry. What keeps Derrick Henry here, I know you asked about Saquon, but Henry is just an elite talent and an elite offense. So he should still be in this S tier. Both of these offenses will continue to put up points, and they're going to do so through these running backs.
Yeah, I mean, Derrick Henry is the engine of the Baltimore Ravens offense, but the reality you're getting with Derrick Henry recently, too, he's given you less than 15 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. Now, less than 15 fantasy points, right? You can obviously do a heck of a lot worse than Derrick Henry, but when you look at Derrick Henry's schedule you brought up Saquon Barkley's schedule, but Derrick Henry, he gets the Chargers in week 12, the Eagles in week 13, goes on bye, as you mentioned, in week 14. You get a fine matchup with the Giants in week 15, but then Pittsburgh and Houston to close out in weeks 16 and 17, That is a difficult stretch of matchups down the stretch versus, like you said, Saquon Barkley has got, I don't want to call it a cakewalk of a schedule, but this is now 2 years in a row where the Philadelphia Eagles have had a top 5 schedule for running backs down the stretch. They can't keep getting away with this, right? But we've seen when you put Saquon Barkley on a talented team like the Philadelphia Eagles and let him get to work, my gosh, we're looking at an entirely different animal here. So I am with you. I prefer Saquon Barkley to Derrick Henry rest of season. But let's talk about these guys in the A tier now, Ty, because this is where I think we could have a conversation of should one of these guys belong in the S tier, or should multiple of these players belong in the S tier? Christian McCaffery, Bijan Robinson, Alvin Kamara, Devon Achane, Kyren Williams, Breece Hall are players in the A tier. Would you move Christian McCaffrey or Bijan Robinson up to the S tier? Because I strongly debated if we should bump those 2 up or just bump Christian McCaffrey up.
So interesting you ask about Bijan. I'll first answer about McCaffrey. I think McCaffrey, Green Bay, Buffalo, Chicago, the Rams, Dolphins, and Lions the rest of the year. There's an argument to keep him here in this A tier as, again, the number 3 guy, and that's in our consensus rankings, number 3, which is not a bad ranking by any means. I personally would throw him into S tier just because ever since coming off of the bye week, I'm not going to say that McCaffrey is the McCaffrey of old, but the role is there, right? And we've seen that that he can come through in that role, obviously, as like the overall running back 1 in fantasy football. For Bijan, this one's a bit of an interesting one because he goes into the Falcons have their bye week in week 12.
Yep.
Then they get the Chargers and the Vikings of the first 2 games out of the bye. So not great. But then you get the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders in your fantasy playoffs. And again, if you play in week 18, you get Carolina. So I feel like 4 is a perfect spot. When I check out like Fantasy Pros, their expert consensus rankings for the rest of the year when it comes to these running backs, they have Bijan at 2. And in my opinion, that feels very much a like, hey, look what's in fantasy playoffs.
Yes.
Let's not worry about what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks with the bye week and the Chargers and the Vikings. Yep. So I feel like 4 in this A tier is like the perfect spot for Bijan because it's like, hey, these 3 games or the next 3 weeks, kind of dicey, but then afterwards it's just fantasy gold.
Yeah. I want to go back to Christian McCaffrey. The only reason why I don't think he's in the S tier right now is because we've only had 2 games back. And in those 2 games, he's been great. He's finished as the running back 10 and the running back 13, but it's only been on 16.7 and 14.6 fantasy points. Now, that's, yeah, you can say, well, Lucas, you just made the point that Derrick Henry has only scored less than 15 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. You can make that case against me. My not concern, but I don't know if we're going to get that like top 3 Christian McCaffrey this season when he's been dealing with this Achilles tendonitis all season long, and it's going to be a little bit more of a ramp up, right? Like, but yet they don't really have time for it to be a ramp up after they lost to the Seahawks on Sunday. They don't have time for it to be a ramp up. So could they just throw Christian McCaffrey back into this massive workload again? The role has seemingly been there. I mean, 24 opportunities, 22 opportunities in his first 2 games back. Do we see that get knocked up to 25, 26 opportunities? I think we totally could. My only concern is just like, hey, I'm not going to ignore that we missed Christian McCaffrey for the first 10 weeks. Like, I'm just not going to ignore that. So that's my only concern with Christian McCaffrey, but I think you could make a case for him to be in the S tier. As for Bijan, I agree. I think he fits perfectly right at the top of this A tier of it could be great rest of season. You know, if we're talking just playoff schedules, like, yeah, Bijan Robinson would be in the S tier, but when we're looking rest of season, you have to factor in before we get to the playoffs too. And unfortunately, that's what would probably knock him down into this A tier. I 100% agree with you there. Let's keep it moving. Well, before we keep it moving though, got to remind the people, if you're not subscribed to us here over on YouTube, make sure you do that. We are coming out tomorrow with our top 20 wide receiver rankings rest of season. We go live on Sunday before kickoff. Sorry you missed us on Sunday. We had some scheduling conflicts, and Cameron had a little bit of a tummy ache, so he wasn't able to go live. Look, obviously just pulling his leg. Make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications over here, though. I promise if you consider subscribing, do so. You'll fall in love with our channel. We're here, a bunch of dudes talking fantasy football, trying to have fun, provide a little bit of extra insight into the game too. So appreciate you all who have subscribed already. If you haven't, make sure you do that, and especially if you're over on our podcast feed as well. But let's transition here to Alvin Kamara, Devon Achane, Kyren Williams, and Breece Hall to close out this tier tie. The biggest difference in our rankings is that you have the utmost confidence in Alvin Kamara rest of season. You have him as your running back 2 rest of the season versus I have him all the way down at running back 8. Where is your optimism coming from here? Because it's not that I don't share in your optimism. I think I might be a little bit low on Alvin Kamara, but based on how my rankings shook out, like, I feel okay having Alvin Kamara, in the 6, 7, 8 range instead of top 3 like you do. So where's your confidence coming from there?
My confidence is really stemming from the fact that Alvin Kamara quite possibly might be the most matchup proof running back in all of fantasy football outside of Saquon Barkley.
Sure.
Because of the receiving role that he has, because of the touches that he can get in a single game. I mean, we are 3 weeks removed from a Carolina matchup in which the Saints lost, but he still had 29 carries, right? And he had 6 receptions. He's gotten games with 11 targets and 9 targets and 8 targets and stuff like that. So I get that the Saints offense isn't the most exciting offense, right? I get that the situation, the general situation, I'll call it, is not one that gets you excited. But when you look at the skill set of Alvin Kamara and you look at recent performances, the role that he has, I really don't care that, some of these matchups may not be the greatest. He's matchup proof in my book. And so I rate that a little more highly than some of the volatility that we may get for it, with guys like a Bijan or a guy like Derrick Henry, even, because we know that those guys are kind of dependent on just how good their offense is in games. Like we saw Derrick Henry just this past Sunday against Pittsburgh. Wasn't great because this Baltimore offense wasn't really putting up that many points against Pittsburgh. So again, I just rate the matchup proof ability of Alvin Kamara more than some of the other guys.
Which I don't think is a wrong way to look at this. You get him on bye in week 12, but then you get the Rams, the Giants, the Commanders, the Packers, and Raiders to close out the regular season. And then if you do play into week 18, you get a nice match with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So it actually is like a somewhat cushy schedule here for Alvin Kamara down the stretch. I actually really do like him rest of season, but My biggest concern is he hasn't scored a touchdown in his last 5 games. We saw Taysom Hill pop off this last week, steal all of the touchdowns from Alvin Kamara. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen every single week, but if we want Alvin Kamara to truly have that top 10, top 5 level performances, I mean, it's going to need to come on the back of 8 targets, 5 receptions for 40 yards, right? 9 targets, 6 receptions for 60 yards. Like, we're really going to need to see this uptick in the passing game. Do I think that can happen? Absolutely. I'm just not as optimistic on it when I look at other guys in this tier, such as a Devon Achane, such as a Kyren Williams, such as a Breece Hall. I think Alvin Kamara belongs in this tier. Do not get me wrong. You could put him in any order in this tier, probably maybe ahead of Bijan, maybe after Bijan, but like you could have Kamara anywhere in this year. I do think he belongs, but that's why I'm like less optimistic than a Devon Achane or a Kyren Williams. Speaking of those two, let's talk a little bit about Devon Achane, Kyren Williams, Breece Hall, because these are 3 guys. I think it's a pick your poison. I really do. Do you think that's a fair way to describe these 3? Like, you can't go wrong with any of them, but do you have a preference out of these 3 who you like rest of season? Do you have a strong leaning?
I would personally say it's Achane for me, just because he has taken over this backfield, not just by the fantasy points between him and Raheem Mostert, but Achane over the last 3 weeks, 69% of snaps, 70% of snaps, 62% of snaps. Achane has taken over this backfield, and that was the big thing going into the year of Achane. Like, Mostert might still take the goal line work and might get the majority of carries and stuff like that. It's Achane's backfield at this point. There's no 1A, 1B at this point. So I would prefer Achane. I don't mind Kyren Williams just because of the offense that he's associated with. I would say for sure, though, the guy that I'm least, intrigued by is Breece Hall here, just because I still I can't figure out this Jets offense. I can't figure out the Jets team in general, right? And I know that Breece's schedule is one of the best remaining schedules the rest of the year.
Yeah.
But again, I have too many question marks about this Jets team in general to make me say, yeah, I would want Breece over an Achane and Kyren.
So you bring up an important point with Achane. He is the running back room right now for the Miami Dolphins. I mean, there is no Raheem Mostert anymore. Raheem Mostert on Sunday, yeah, he left a little bit early with a hip injury. Came back and played, though. Only played 10 of a possible 68 snaps this last week. Jalen Wright has now played ahead of him for the second week in a row. You and I have had more rushing yards than Raheem Mostert over the last 2 weeks, Ty. -2 rushing yards. So you and I have been feasting out here while Raheem Mostert has been doing all the hard work, totaling 3 carries and getting -2 yards, right? So it is Achane, and he's getting it done in the receiving game too. Now, it's a coin flip between him and Kyren Williams for me. I like Kyren's schedule down the stretch. He's a touchdown machine. You could flip a coin between those two, and I'd be okay with either. But I think I'm with you that Breece is my least favorite out of this grouping. And I mentioned this last week when you and I, at this same time last week, when we were talking about rest of season schedules. I'm terrified of this Jets offense imploding on itself. I am. And it looked like they were going to in the first half against the Colts. And they take yet another bad loss. And I'm terrified of this team rest of the season just tossing in the towel and not giving a crap anymore. And that's not to say that Breece Hall still can't eat. I mean, it came at the detriment of Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams this week. Breece Hall had himself a week, right? Scored 2 touchdowns. But I'm with you. Like, if it's one of these offenses that I'm least confident in, it's definitely the New York Jets offense. And I'm worried Breece Hall is the more volatile one week over week. Is that a fair assessment? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Breece has, steadily gotten touches week in, week out ever since the change in play caller from to Todd Downing. I can't even remember.
Nathaniel Hackett. From Nathaniel Hackett, right.
That's how bad it was. And I wish that was a bit. I seriously spaced for a second there. But yeah, for Breece, I mean, 16, 15, 10, and 16 carries in his last 4. He's gotten 1, 2, 4, and 7 receptions in those games as well. Sure, he can get touches, but we had talked about Breece. I want to say it was in the remaining schedules for the rest of the year. Maybe it was last week when we talked about it. he's just not getting enough of the high value touches. Like he got it against Indy for sure. He found the end zone, got 7 catches, and he actually scored on them too. So when he can, capitalize on those, he's great. But again, like you said, it's the volatility of this Jets team that makes me just say, like, I really don't want to, put any stake in the Jets for the rest of the year because you just don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah, and I think people will throw a counterpunch here and talk about Kyren, how he's actually scored less than 12 fantasy points in each of the last 3 weeks. The thing that I like about Kyren, though, he's still getting a majority of the rushing work. He has seen 6 targets and 7 targets in 2 of his last 4 games. He's caught 5 passes in 2 of his last 4 games. He's still involved in the passing game here to some extent. The killer is that he hasn't scored a touchdown in 3 straight contests after scoring in every single game to start the season. I don't think that's going to be the norm, especially when you get New Orleans, Buffalo, San Francisco, you get the Jets, you can run on a little bit, you get Arizona as well. I mean, outside of Philly this week in week 12, this is a schedule that I actually don't mind down the stretch. And I think we see a regression to the mean here, quote unquote regression to the mean of Kyren probably scoring 2 out of every 3 weeks, but not every week, but 2 out of every 3 weeks going down the stretch. And, we're looking at him as a top 10 guy, a top 12 guy almost every single week instead of barely knocking on the door of top 30. So that's why I'm willing to say we get a bounce back here from Kyren Williams versus Breece Hall. We might get a 20+ point week. We might also get only an 8-point week from the guy, and I don't know which we're going to get. I think Kyren, I feel more confident of giving me that 15 every single week than I do Breece Hall down the stretch. So that's kind of the tiebreaker for me in this tier.
Yeah. Also, one last thing on Kyren. He's the running back 6 in usage this year.
Yes.
Like, keep the faith, right? Like, keep on trusting Kyren. He has given you absolutely no reason. I know it's been tough it's been tough the last couple of weeks, but keep the faith.
Let's take a quick break here, Ty. We're through 8 running backs, 2 tiers. We'll be back with the remaining after the break. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. We have covered the S tier and the A tier of our rest of season running backs. We have covered 8 different backs. Let's move on to the B tier now, Ty, where we have Joe Mixon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Kenneth Walker, and Jonathan Taylor. Can we title this tier the not quite elite in fantasy football, but also significantly better than the field? That's a really long title. But when I was building out these tiers, it's like, man, we could shove these guys in the A tier, but I don't know if they're going to provide the exact same level of production as everybody else in the A tier. But I'll tell you what, they're certainly better than everybody else in the C tier, right? It's like this awkward middle tier of these dudes are talented, but they're just not quite to that elite tier in the A tier. It's Joe Mixon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Taylor, as I mentioned. Who's your preference out of this bunch? That's where we'll start, because you could throw one of these dudes at the wall, see if they stick, and I would tell you you're probably right in that it's going to stick, and they're going to be the one to lead this bunch rest of season.
Man, personally, I think it comes down to Mixon and Gibbs for me. Let me actually go back through my actual rankings real quick.
It is between Mixon and Gibbs for you. You have Joe Mixon at 8 and Jahmyr Gibbs at 10.
I think I lean Mixon just because of how it's been the last 4 weeks for Mixon.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
25, 25, 24, and 25 carries. I'm not getting that in any other running back that we're going to talk about for the rest of the day. So I kind of lean Mixon, but I can also understand somebody going, well, Jahmyr Gibbs, has been arguably one of the best running backs in all of football this year in this Detroit offense. Yeah. And so by association, you're kind of inheriting just, this Detroit offense continuing to be arguably the best unit in all of football. So I get going Gibbs, but I look, stats don't lie, man. Mixon is getting the ball at an insane rate. I'm not going to really deviate from that.
So yeah, and we're recording this before Monday Night Football when they play the Dallas Cowboys. So Ty's mentioning the last 4 weeks. He's not including tonight's game where Joe Mixon could very easily get fed another 24, 25 times against the Dallas Cowboys, right? I lean Gibbs. This was one I genuinely had to chew through. And what it came down to was I'm going to trust the efficiency of this Detroit Lions offense and the rate at which they run the ball. And what that means for Jahmyr Gibbs. I mean, obviously, they clear the league in running back usage this year. But down the stretch, I mean, week 12, it's Indy, Chicago, Green Bay, Buffalo, Chicago again. You mix in San Francisco, which teams I don't think people realize you can run on San Francisco a little bit. They're not the same defense as they were last year, where they were stingy against the run. But I'm just going to trust Dan Campbell and the rate at which he's used, and Ben Johnson at the rate at which they're using these running backs here. And Mixon is getting, close to double the carries that Jahmyr Gibbs is getting. Gibbs is sitting right around this like 12 to 18 rush attempts per game kind of bunch, but that one's a coin flip. That one's a coin flip for me because Mixon, I have Jahmyr Gibbs at 9 and Mixon at 10 rest of season. So I like both guys quite a bit. But let's talk about these other two. Which order do you have Kenneth Walker and Jonathan Taylor in rest of season?
I go Kenneth Walker, then Jonathan Taylor.
So we're in agreement there.
Yeah, I lean Kenneth Walker just because, in what has been a very up and down season for his usage, there is an insane ceiling that he gives me week to week that I've yet to see really from Jonathan Taylor. Now, that's not to say that Jonathan Taylor can be, or that he's a bad asset to have on a fantasy team, but you can really just look at the remaining schedule and go, yikes. I still will lean Walker. I mean, you get Detroit this upcoming week in week 12, and it's like, oh boy, that's not gonna be fun. Then he gets New England, and you're like, oh, okay.
Much better.
Then it's a bye in week 14, and then you go Denver and Tennessee in the first 2 games right off of it.
Those are 2 of the stingier matchups right now for running backs.
Exactly. Versus Kenneth Walker, Arizona, the Jets, Arizona again, Green Bay, Minnesota, and Chicago. I'm willing to take the chance like Kenneth Walker in those matchups, giving me 15 instead of Jonathan Taylor in a wonky schedule the rest of the year, trying to give me 15 as well.
I'm also going to say one of them has Anthony Richardson at quarterback and the other one doesn't. And that's not to rip on Anthony Richardson. It is the fact that we just saw Anthony Richardson score 2 rushing touchdowns this week, right? And if Jonathan Taylor isn't going to get that boost from the rushing touchdown department, where if you're like a little bit more concerned about that, part of me just like wants to lean Kenneth Walker and just say, you know what? Like I really, really like the Seattle Seahawks offense. I think they can find themselves in scoring position frequently. And when they're around the goal line, guess who it's going to be? It's going to be Ken Walker. So I'm with you. I have Ken Walker ahead of Jonathan Taylor. But I wouldn't blame if someone wanted to come back and say Jonathan Taylor should be ahead of Ken Walker. I agree with your analysis of like, look, it's not that Jonathan Taylor's going to be bad rest of season, but you get a stingy matchup, you get an easy matchup, you go into the bye week. Again, week 14 is such a tough week to have a bye to close out the season. And then in 15 and 16 to start the playoffs, you get 2 stingy matchups. Like I'm not a big fan of that. I'll take Ken Walker over JT rest of season, but again, more of a coin flip than what we're probably making it out to be. Let's move on down to the C tier, Ty. This is again the like you're almost there, but not quite tier, right? It's the like I'm glad these guys are my running back 2s. That's how I feel about all the guys in this tier. Is these are your confident, solidified, high end running back 2s, and that is James Cook, James Conner, David Montgomery, and Josh Jacobs. You feel really good about them. These are the guys where if they're your running back 1, you're not feeling great. But if they're your running back 2s, you're like, I'm locked in. I've got a top running back duo in the entire league. Let's first talk about James Cook because he is highest in our consensus rankings. You have him up at 13. I have him down at 16. What keeps him at the top of this tier for you?
It's the association of being in this Bills offense, and he has been a touchdown machine this year. He's got 10 rushing touchdowns on
Shockingly,
the year.
yeah.
I know. And in its last 5, he had 6 touchdowns. So it's been volatile too. I won't, I won't ignore that fact, right? 12 carries, no catches against Tennessee in week 7. They got 17 carries and 3 catches in week 8, 10 carries and 5 catches in week 9, 19 carries and just 1 catch in week 10, and then 9 carries and 5 catches against Kansas City. It's up and down. It is 1000% up and down. But if he's going to keep scoring because of this Buffalo offense being able to move the ball up and down the field, I'm willing to take the chance on again the up and down and the unevenness of this workload if he's going to continue to score. And I think he can when he's going to get matchups against Kansas City, against San Francisco and against the Rams and Detroit and New England and the Jets. Some of those games they will need to put up points. And then in the other games they can rely on James Cook, right? So I still have enough faith in Cook to kind of put him over the rest of the guys in this tier that I think you definitely have an argument to put over him.
Yeah, because James Conner sits at the top of this tier for me. And part of it is he's just all reliable. I mean, he's only giving you 2 games with less than 14 fantasy points this year. And you look at his schedule down the stretch. I mean, it's Seattle. You don't like Minnesota. Seattle again, though. And then New England and Carolina to kick off the fantasy playoffs. I mean, James Conner could go for 20 plus in both of those games and give you, again, that 14 to 15 range in these other games. And you're looking at James Conner as like your solidified high-end running back 2 rest of season. So that's the reason why I have James Conner ahead of James Cook is, look, I think James Cook could probably keep scoring touchdowns. I wonder if he's been running a little bit hot in that department, though. You mentioned 5 over the last 6 weeks. I'm not banking on that continuing, especially when he put up only 27 total yards against the Chiefs, but he just happened to stumble into the end zone twice, right? Like, I'm not saying, look, I hate being the guy who's like, take away those 2 touchdowns and he stinks, right? Like, obviously. But even if you take away 1, that's only 13 fantasy points on the week. And James Conner can give you that on a normal day when he, rips you off, 90 rushing yards on 20 attempts and catches another, 30 through the air on 3 receptions, right? Like, these two are very, very similar. I think James Conner is more stable than James Cook, but I have nothing against James Cook either rest of season. Obviously he's in this tier for a reason. And he's in good company here too. It's not like these guys are slouches. And, when we look at the next year, like James Cook is well above the guys in the next year too, I think.
Yeah, well, and James Conner, over the last 4 weeks has shown a really, really high floor. 17.2, 15, 15, and 22, right? So there is absolute reason to continue trusting James Conner. And again, the schedule is there too. This Arizona offense as well, playing a lot better as well. That only helps James Conner. So I get it. I get it. If I had to choose just an offense to stake my claim on for the rest of the season, I would say Buffalo over Arizona, but totally. It's more pro Buffalo than anything anti Arizona, if that makes sense.
No, 100%. And I think that's a completely valid point too, as I clear my throat there. The Buffalo offense has just been running so hot recently. I mean, when you knock off the Chiefs 30-21 on Sunday, I mean, without, a Keon Coleman on the field even as well. I mean, and 27 total yards from James Cook. Yeah, you're right. I would rather be hitched to this Bills offense rest of season. So again, no fault in that whatsoever. Then we do have David Montgomery and Josh Jacobs closing out this tier. David Montgomery is a guy that you and I and Cameron too have been talking about forever now. I have Josh Jacobs ahead of David Montgomery rest of the season, but this is truly like coin flip. Again, I feel like I'm mentioning that a lot when we're talking within tiers here. All these guys are going to be coin tosses, but we're doing our best to try and distinguish like where are our leanings within these tiers. But you at least know we like all of these guys, and we see them with relatively the same value rest of season. So what is it for you that keeps David Montgomery ahead of Josh Jacobs here? But I also I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to disagree with anything you say because this was one that I went back and forth on.
this is another, Buffalo versus Arizona debate for me. I like Detroit's offense the rest of the season more than Green Bay's. I think their schedules the rest of the year are a bit of a wash. I think they're about even, to be completely honest with you. I was about to say that, like, I think Josh Jacobs is a little more touchdown dependent than David Montgomery, which I immediately was like, that's the dumbest thing you could ever say. Like,
let's say I'm glad you swallowed that, because I'm like, I don't know about that.
But Josh Jacobs, like the last 4 weeks, he's been coming through. I mean, 20.2, 25.5, 12.8, 23 and 23.4. Maybe the best way to the correct comment I was going to make is David Montgomery and Josh Jacobs are the touchdown dependent running backs of this ranking. And if you're going to bank on touchdowns, I'm personally going to lean Montgomery.
Sure.
But you can definitely lean Jacobs just based on recent performances and hoping that trend continues the rest of the year.
I also prefer Josh Jacobs because I think you get a little bit more of a boost in the receiving department too. I mean, again, we saw him 5 targets, 4 catches last week, 3 targets, 2 catches before their bye week. We've seen 6 and 4 again, 5 and 5 again earlier in the year. So I think he can give you a necessary boost in the receiving game as well. He's not going to give you any receiving touchdowns. He's only scored 1 of those in his career, and it was just a few weeks ago. So don't expect lightning to strike twice there. But I mean, if only 4 touchdowns for Josh Jacobs on the season, despite can you look up what his usage numbers are for me? I mean, his usage is through the roof this year. I mean, it's a top 10 number for sure in the running back department. I look, when you're getting Josh Jacobs 22 touches and he only has around 22-ish touches per game, 22 touches per game. He's only scored 4 touchdowns on the year. Something there has to give. So I think Josh Jacobs, for me, beats out David Montgomery in that department. Even though, again, I see these guys very similarly. I think David Montgomery is going to run much hotter in the touchdown department. I also think Josh Jacobs has a lot of room to improve on his touchdown numbers with how many touches he's getting fed this year.
Josh Jacobs, let's see here. He's been about middle of the pack. Like, actually,
he has been
running back 16. Sorry.
Okay.
So middle of the pack is in like top 24, top 25.
A little bit less than I expected. I expected that number to be closer to top 12.
Which I think kind of surprises everybody.
Yeah.
I'm going to be.
I mean, if he's getting 18, 19, 20 rushing attempts per game, the problem is that receiving work isn't as consistent as I might have laid it out to be, which is again, a fair counter argument to having David Montgomery ahead of Josh Jacobs as well. But I think Jacobs has been running a little bit more hot. I think Monty is a little bit more of the touchdown dependent one, and I think we'll probably see some of that touchdown momentum swing back in favor of Josh Jacobs. Like, if he has 4 touchdowns in his final 6 games, would you be surprised by that?
No, not at all.
Yeah, which is where I think the pendulum might be swinging for Josh Jacobs here. Let's close out with this last tier here, Ty. It's Aaron Jones, Chase Brown, DeAndre Swift, Tyrone Tracy, all in the D tier. It gets thin quick, right? Once you get past the top 15, 16 here, it thins out pretty quick. I think Aaron Jones potentially has a case to be in the C tier. Would you bump Aaron Jones up to the C tier, or would you keep him in this D tier?
I would probably keep him at the top of the D tier just because this Minnesota offense is not really going at the clip they were. Oh my word, can't do the grammar today.
Can't do the grammar.
Minnesota's offense is not what it was the first 7 weeks of the season. I mean, 19, 21, 17, and 15 carries for Aaron Jones in his last 4, but only going for 11.5, 12.2, 12.1, and 5.3 in those games does concern me a little bit that, like, hey, if he does get a rough matchup, it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah, I'm with you there. It's just when you look at Chase Brown, DeAndre Swift, Tyrone Tracy, and you're like, man, are they have they been playing that well to be in the same conversation as Aaron Jones? And the answer is yes to that question. I'm not asking that question as if I'm questioning it. Chase Brown has been on fire. Tyrone Tracy has been given 16 plus rushing attempts in 5 of his last 6. He's 5th in rushing yards on the season. or fifth, not on the seasons, in his last 6 games. He is 5th in rushing yards in the entire league. And he's just coming off of his bye week, still 5th in rushing yards. I mean, he has been hot. And with the Giants being 2-8 on the season, pivoting to Tommy Cutlass, Tommy DeVito, right? Like, why would you go back to Devin Singletary? That's my question. There's no reason to go back to Devin Singletary when the season's in the bat and all but out the window. Let's see what kind of real juice Tyrone Tracy has. So that's why I'm like, yeah, these dudes belong in the same tier as Aaron Jones. But you and I agree. Aaron Jones is at the top of this tier. Is Chase Brown your preference next? That's the order we have him in. Is he your preference out of DeAndre Swift and Tyrone Tracy?
Yeah, he would be. Like you said, for Chase Brown, he's been on fire as of late.
So good.
He's gotten 2 games in his last 3 with 20 or more carries. But in each of his last 3 games, he's gotten 5 or more receptions, including 1 game with 9 catches for 11 targets.
Yeah.
On 11 targets.
Just nutty stuff.
Nutty stuff. And I mentioned this when I was talking about wide receiver starts last week. And I was like, you should start T. Higgins because the Bengals, at least going into Sunday, were first in pass rate over expected, which means they prefer to pass the ball more than any team in the league. That helps Chase Brown out, right? Even though, yeah, he's going to lack the rushing, the rushing attempts. I will say the 27 to 22 carries are going to be the anomalies by season's end. But if he's going to continue to give me like 5 receptions, 6 receptions a game, and he's going to mix in 12, 13 carries, boy, yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, this Cincinnati offense, for the struggles that we kind of associated with Cleveland or with Cincinnati this year, the 41, 34, and 27 points in the last 3 games. This offense still puts up points.
Yeah.
So I think Chase Brown should definitely be the next guy up here. Just better offense of the next 2 guys. And he's been coming through lately.
I want to switch my ranking on Tyrone Tracy and DeAndre Swift. I want to put Tyrone Tracy ahead of DeAndre Swift rest of season. I don't think that actually impacts the order we have these 2 in. Yeah. You ready for DeAndre Swift's schedule rest of season? Have you taken a look at it? I mean, I'm sure you have. Minnesota, Detroit, San Francisco, Minnesota again, Detroit again, then Seattle and Green Bay, which you can run a little bit on Seattle and Green Bay. But man, to get Minnesota and Detroit 4 times down the stretch, that is brutal. That is brutal versus when you look at Tyrone Tracy's schedule then. Tampa Bay, yes. Dallas, sure. On Thanksgiving, which, the Tommy DeVito Cooper Rush Classic on Thanksgiving, what we're all hungry for. New Orleans Saints, the Ravens, gross, but Atlanta, Indy, Philadelphia to close out the season. So that playoff stretch isn't as nice. But man, over the next 3 weeks, I mean, those are some great matchups that Tyrone Tracy is drawing here. And if he's going to continue to be the guy, I might like him more than Swift rest of season. But again, not to use the coin flip example, but those 2 really do feel like a coin flip to me rest of season. I do think we have it correct. And like, it's Chase Brown and Aaron Jones, or Aaron Jones and Chase Brown. You can make the case for Chase Brown being above Aaron Jones, but then, yeah, it's DeAndre Swift or Tyrone Tracy. And I don't know if I have a strong preference there. I'm going back and forth, but man, that gauntlet for Swift with Minnesota and Detroit in 4 games down the stretch, that sounds terrible.
Yeah, I think these are 2 guys that I'm just like, you know what? If we had to leave 2 names off, it would probably be these 2 names because
they'd be the first 2 to go. I agree.
I just don't want really anything to do with their offenses the rest of the year.
Sure.
To be completely, no matter how good the matchups are.
Hey, you know what? Bears looked all right under Thomas Brown, though, man. You know what? They looked all right. They looked all right.
Don't go there.
Hey, when you watch the film, this offense looked significantly better than whatever Shane Waldron was putting out there.
We mentioned a name before we started recording. I would much rather have the honorable mention than these 2 guys.
Okay, well, let's get into the honorable mentions then. Let's do it. Let's do it. Guys, we could have put on this list. Tony Pollard is next. You have, well, technically not quite next, but we'll get into the guy. Yeah, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, J.K. Dobbins, and Brian Robinson were the next 4 names on that list. Out of those 4, who's your preference? I know you prefer our secret guy that I'm holding out on here, but
Yes.
Out of those 4, who do you prefer? Because I think those are 4 you could throw in any order, and I'm not. That would be the next tier, if we're being perfectly honest.
Yeah, I would say Ramondre.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, yes, it's not the New England offense is not an exciting offense by any means, but
yeah,
his schedule is one that I prefer just because the guy has been getting 20 or more touches in his last 4 straight games, and some of his matchups are allowing some of the most yards per carry. So I'm like, you know what? Like, on the chance that he just continues to get fed regardless of what the game, what the game script is, there's something there for Ramondre. I'll say, like, the J.K. Dobbins thing, the Gus Edwards involvement kind of worries me a little bit now at this point, like with how much it's impacted him.
Yeah.
The Brian Robinson one, I think there's an argument there, just again being associated with Jane Daniels, but we do need to start having a conversation that this Washington offense is not really as good as they were just last month.
Which is fair. I mean, Cliff's been doing a great job. I mean, the Eagles have been so much better over the last month, though. I mean, I do think they just like hit an on fire Eagles defense. I don't know if that's necessarily as big of an indictment on the Washington offense, but I'm not going to disagree and say that Washington's offense has been playing at, the same level it was a month prior. I think they hit. I agree. I think it's been they've downgraded a bit, but not to the point where I'm like concerned. I just think they've hit a Chicago defense that's been really tough, and then also the Eagles defense who they've played in the last month too, which is also just they've been a brutal matchup as of late. But I hear you on that. I think my preference would be Tony Pollard out of this bunch. Part of it is, Tyjae Spears is still in and out with injury. I do like the Titans schedule down the stretch, but you could toss any of those guys. Ramondre was at the top of my list, and then I switched to Tony Pollard, and you can make it any of these guys. But really, Ty, the guy that we do need to talk about is Isiah Pacheco, because he's the guy that you would have inside of this D tier. I don't think I would have Pacheco inside of my top 20 rest of the season. Give me the bull case on Isiah Pacheco here, because I'm definitely more bearish rest of season.
So I think I would start this off with a question to you. How involved do you think Kareem Hunt stays in this offense?
I think Kareem Hunt remains involved in a change of pace role where it's going to be annoying enough where I'm worried about Isiah Pacheco and his efficiency coming back off of this injury right away. I don't think he's going to be the same running back that we saw at the start of the season or at the tail end of last season. Like, we saw the Chiefs really ride Pacheco to that Super Bowl. I don't think we're going to get that. And I think Kareem Hunt is going to be that, like, change of pace. This is going to be here's how I'm going to phrase it. This feels very Zach Moss, Chase Brown at the start of the year to me. That's how I'm gonna say this. It feels very Zach Moss, Chase Brown, where you're going to see Isiah Pacheco get a lot of the goal line early down work, and I think you're going to see Kareem Hunt probably filter in on later downs a little bit more. Or what might be even worse, Samaje Perine filters in on those downs, and you see Kareem Hunt take a little bit of the early down workload off of Isiah Pacheco. I just don't think we can expect this like 80% snap share for Isiah Pacheco just to return to normal. That's where I'm worried. And I don't think the Chiefs have a need to rush him back right away rest of season.
Which is fair. There is definitely risk associated with kind of banking on a running back coming off of an injury like his the rest of the season. But I will say, I don't think Isiah Pacheco needs to get the 80% usage or whatever, or the snap share or whatever it was to be great in fantasy football. Yeah, we're not going to get top 10 Isiah Pacheco like we were kind of expecting at the beginning of the year. But in terms of all the guys that we kind of have towards the low end running back twos, right? 19 to 24 and then 25 to 30. If Pacheco, I don't want to call it the David Montgomery role, but I mean, if David Montgomery can be our running back 15 on just 42% of snaps over his last 6 games, why can't Isiah Pacheco also have that? So maybe I'm kind of hypothesizing and thinking out loud that there's this imaginary role that Isiah Pacheco is, automatically going to walk into, where he doesn't need to play. He doesn't need to have the role that he had at the beginning of the season. But if he's going to be getting the high value touches in this offense, I know this Kansas City offense hasn't been as great, but getting an Isiah Pacheco back in any kind of fashion helps you out. So maybe again, I'm imagining too much here. I'm predicting too much. I'm willing to take the chance though, because out of all the other guys kind of in this range, I feel like I'm also taking a chance on.
So what you're going to need from Isiah Pacheco down the stretch, I think, to crack top 20s, you're going to need somewhere between like a 65 to 70% snap share, which I don't think is unreasonable. But what we saw at the tail end of last season too is that Pacheco was getting involved in the passing attack. 5 targets, 4 targets, 4 targets, 7 targets, catching all but one of them down the stretch. You're going to need to see Isiah Pacheco fall into the end zone. I mean, he scored in 3 of 4 postseason games last year. In the Super Bowl, we saw him catch 6 passes against the 49ers. Yet he only scored 13.2 fantasy points in that game. It worries me that it's going to be like 50% Pacheco, it's going to be 30% Kareem Hunt, and then it's going to be, 10% split the other ways. It just feels messier than just saying, Pacheco, you're in, get back to work. I just don't have that much confidence in him down the stretch coming off of this injury that I think Cameron pointed out prior to. I didn't do the extensive research on this, but like if it's an injury similar to Tony Pollard's, I mean, Pollard took almost a year to come back from it, right? Like I am a little bit worried about that. So we'll agree to disagree there. You're more optimistic, yet, at the end of the day, we're only, 3-4 spots apart on Pacheco. So it's not like we're eons apart from each other, but you definitely have more optimism than I do. I'm not as confident in Pacheco rest of season. Any icing you want to put on the cake here before we sign off?
I know you guys all agree with our rankings, so tell us how great they were in the comments.
Definitely not going to cause any controversy with these rankings. None at all. We appreciate when you all comment down below. We'll try and get back to a few of you, explain where they're at in our rest of season rankings. Maybe do not necessarily validating, but just showing you how close or how far apart some of these running backs actually are. But no, we appreciate hearing from you all in the comments. And again, if you're not subbed already, make sure you do that and turn on that notification bell as well, so you know when all of our newest content is coming up. We got wide receiver rankings tomorrow. We've got players who will change your outcome coming on Thursday. And then next week as well, correct me if I'm wrong, Ty, we're going to get into some playoff heroes next week. Some guys that if your waiver wire hasn't, or your trade deadline hasn't passed yet in your league, it's like last second, got to get them in trades. Or if you got these guys on your team, you could potentially be winning a championship down the stretch. So we'll talk about some playoff heroes next week, get into some risers and fallers and rankings as well. So we've got a wide variety of content coming up for you here. So again, make sure you're sub, turn on the notification bell, and follow us on the other socials as well. FFL is on Twitter. DFFL is on Instagram. Fantasy Football Fellas on Facebook and TikTok. I don't know. Maybe we'll get on that Blue Sky thing sometime soon. Ty and I are on Blue Sky. If you want to go follow us, it's our same usernames as over on X. At Lucas Wenzel for me, Tyler_Plath for Tyler. If you got a Blue Sky handle down below, drop it. I'm curious how many of our viewers actually have Blue Sky. How many have made the jump over there? It's on like a record-breaking pace of new signups. Did you see that? Like at this pace, like they said by the end of this week, or was it by the end of the month, they'd be up to like 30 million users or something like that. I couldn't believe it.
That's crazy.
They're coming for you, Elon. No, X will always have a special place and will always remain relevant. But fun to get on Blue Sky a little bit, see what that's about. Anyways, we're way off track now. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. We'll see you next time. Deuces.